There never was a good war or a bad peace. That's how Benjamin Franklin put it just a week after signing the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783, an effort to officially end the war for independence. But unlike what most history books will teach you, what most podcasters ever will teach you, the war actually didn't officially end with the signatures of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay on that date. There were 13 free, sovereign, and independent states that still needed to give their approval, or at least 9 of them according to the rules of the Articles of Confederation. It almost didn't happen. Thomas Jefferson was basically the floor manager in Congress that was trying to get a dispute resolved between two sides, one that wanted to actually violate the Articles of Confederation, the others, like Thomas Jefferson and his side, that wanted to follow it to its strict limit. Now, this forgotten history, I think, reveals the true nature of what the American revolutionaries viewed as a proper system of states united together for general or limited purposes. I'll get to all that in just a moment, but first of all, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for September 4th, 2024. I want to kick it off here with a quick piece of insight from Tara Ross, who I cite regularly on the show, especially when I highlight the Anti-Federalist Papers. She wrote, "Our history books may teach about the Battle of Yorktown, won by George Washington on October 19th, 1781. But far too often, history books forget to mention that the American victory was followed by 2 long years of political maneuvering as peace negotiations were conducted. And even once they signed a preliminary deal to have peace in 1782, it wasn't official until they signed it in 1783, and then it needed to be ratified by the several states. Now, we got to kick it back, first of all, to the Declaration of Independence to understand the language being used here. And here, of course, we know these united colonies and of right ought to be free and independent states. Mike Meharry points out that the colonies separately declared their independence, even though they were united in the Declaration. But they declared their independence from Great Britain as 13 independent sovereign states. And he also notes that the modern American definition of the term state does get a little confusing for some people because they think a state is just kind of a political subdivision of a giant national government. And that's how they treat states in most situations today. And so that creates some confusion. We think of them as subdivisions of a nation, he writes. But in the 18th century especially, and it should be more so today, state was synonymous with nation. When they declared their independence, Mike writes, Georgia and New York, for example, placed themselves on equal footing with England and Spain. And the Declaration even referred to the state of Great Britain. Now, back to the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson and company continued with this. As free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. These are the things that independent countries do, not necessarily just states in a national system. Now, of course, here's how he puts it as well. He said, note that the Declaration mentions states, plural, not one state, not one singular nation, 13 free and independent states. This is extremely significant because it reveals where we find sovereignty in the political system. It resides in the people of the several states. Now, James Madison, of course, in his report of 1800, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but the quick overview is he said the term state can have various definitions. It could be the political boundary of a particular landmass. It could be a state government. But he says in the constitutional system, for example, the context means the states, the people of the several states in their highest sovereign capacity, the people residing in the several states. Now, so two days after the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock fires off a letter to George Washington, giving him an update. He said the Congress have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies and to declare them, the American colonies, free and independent states. So let's get to this Treaty of Paris, which is actually called the Definitive Treaty of Peace. They call it a definitive treaty because they had a preliminary treaty originally, and that didn't go into effect until they had a definitive one. So the Definitive Treaty of Peace between the Kingdom of Great Britain and the United States of America, signed on September 3rd, 1783, depending when you're watching or listening to the show, yesterday in history. And we see this same principle about free and independent states in this treaty. The first sentence of Article the First in the treaty says this: His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States, New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to be free, sovereign, and independent states. So King George, the Britannic Majesty, was recognizing a peace treaty with 13 free and independent nations. And here from Joe Wolverton, who writes a lot of great stuff we republish from the New American Magazine, we republish here. He said, later in Article 1, George III reaffirms that not only are his former colonies free, sovereign, and independent, but he vows from that day forward to treat with them as such. And treat means to work on treaties. So that's the verb of working on a treaty, planning, etc. So he was going to have treaties potentially with each of them separately. And as a matter of fact, there were some complaints if you read through some of the commissioners or the delegates to the peace treaty negotiations. They talked about how the British really were not interested originally even in speaking with representatives of Congress. They wanted to only go directly to the states, and they didn't like the intermediary. There was some discussion that, well, that was their way of trying to create a fulcrum to get in between them, to get them to fight amongst each other. But they held the line, and they eventually made the treaty. They signed it, worked out the deals on behalf of the several states, but it still had to go back to them. Again, here's how Wolverton puts it. Notice, moreover, George is not signing a treaty with one nation. He is signing a treaty with 13 nations, each of which is listed at the beginning of Article 1. Someone who knows this better than I do might understand whether or not it's still officially enforced today. I believe it is, but who knows? Here from the 5th article of the Treaty of Paris: Congress shall earnestly recommend it to the legislatures of the respective states to provide for the restitution of all estates, rights, and properties which have been confiscated belonging to real British subjects. And Joe notes the important point here. He said, pay close attention to the relative status of Congress of the United States and the legislatures of the respective states comprising that confederation. This was now officially under the Articles of Confederation at this point. And Joe points out that Congress is not tasked with telling the states to restore the property of British subjects confiscated during the war. Congress is just required to, quote, earnestly recommend a course of action to the 13 state governments. The British understood the American system. I mean, they read the document. Thomas Jefferson, we'll get to a little bit later, talks about that. They know what our Articles of Confederation have to say. And if we're not willing to follow the rules of it, we're going to run into a lot of problems with them in any negotiation we have. So they wanted to actually have separate possible treaties with all 13 states, 13 independent sovereign states. Here from the treaty, Article the 7th, there shall be a firm and perpetual peace between His Britannic Majesty and the said states, and between the subjects of the one and the citizens of the other. Wherefore all hostilities both by sea and land shall from henceforth cease. And so now the states are at peace with Britain. And you should notice as well that he's talking about the subjects of Britain and the citizens of the United States, of these several states. We notice the difference in the language that they all agreed to as well, of what the place of the people in society are as well. Subject versus citizen is a huge difference. So Joe says the states are now at peace with Britain. Well, I mean, they had been at peace kind of unofficially for some time, and it still was unofficial here. He said, if Congress is able to convince the state legislatures to agree to the terms. So they have got a deal now for the official, the definitive treaty. So back to that in a moment. Just a couple of quick points from the three guys. We're not talking about Henry Lawrence today. Those of you who understand all the history and detail on that, we're not getting into that. But here's a couple of comments from the three Americans that signed this deal. Here from John Adams on the 5th of September to the President of Congress. I believe it was Elias Boudinot. I don't know how to pronounce the name, but although it is but a confirmation or repetition of the provisional articles. So John Adams was, this is a guy who'd get a little grumpy from time to time, maybe sign into law something that criminalized free speech when he was president. But, he was the Atlas of Independence, considered one of the good guys early on. Certainly was. Mercy Otis Warren lamented his shift to more a monarchical view later on. But anyways, here's how he put it. Although it is but a confirmation or repetition of the provisional articles, like he's saying, man, we went through all this work and we're just doing the same thing that we agreed to last year. Anyways, I have the honor to congratulate Congress upon it, as it is a completion of the work of peace and the best we could obtain. Nothing remains now to be done but a treaty of commerce. Well, he's missing something there. Maybe his mindset is already shifting to nationalist at this point, centralizer, because there is stuff that has to be done. Here back to Benjamin Franklin, that quote, "There never was a good war or a bad peace." That was the other September 11th, back to a letter to Josiah Quincy. He had written a similar statement during the negotiations as well. I forget off the top of my head who he wrote that to. And here's John Jay in a letter to Robert Morris on September 12th. He says, "The definitive treaty is concluded." They all recognize they had negotiated a previous one. "And we are now, thank God, in the full possession of peace and independence. If we are not a happy people now, it will be our own fault." And happiness, pursuit of happiness. We know that one of the most common and widely understood principles of the American Revolution came from the penman of the Revolution, John Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, where he said, we cannot be happy without being free. If we want to understand the founders and the old revolutionaries on the pursuit of happiness, we have to understand that it is grounded in freedom. He said, we cannot be free if others may take our property from us without our consent. If we are not secure in our property, we're not secure in our property if they can take it from us without our consent. So if the people are not happy, in other words, free and secure in their property, it's their own fault. Now, while a lot of people point to September 3rd, as I keep mentioning, as formally ending the war, we can even see John Adams hinting at that as well. It's not true. It needed to be approved by at least 9 of the states out of the 13 under the Articles of Confederation, and that was not an easy thing to get done in 1783 to 1784. More on that in a moment. While I'm here, I want to say that all the stuff that I'm citing, the various articles from Harry and Joe Wolverton, plus the original source documents, the letters from John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, the Treaty of Paris itself, so you can read the full text. I'm just highlighting various parts of it. So if you're really interested in learning more, it's essential for you to read all this stuff in context so you can grasp the whole thing. Hopefully I'm, whetting your appetite to dig in on this. But about 2 hours after the live stream is done, we publish a blog post for every single episode, which has a show links section. So all this stuff that I'm citing, generally in kind of order as I go through it, are linked to there. Alan Mosley does an awesome job getting that organized. Don't forget to tune into his show, It's Too Late, as well. But he does an awesome job organizing the blog post for every episode here. And I'll get that published again. 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty, a couple of hours after this live stream is done. A quick programming note. I'm actually in the middle of a move, so I'm doing my regular schedule this week for the show, but I will be off the entirety of next week starting September 9th, 2024. So if I'm missing, don't fret. We haven't been booted yet, but we'll do our best to get some shorts and maybe a static video or something like that posted as well. Anyways, 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty. I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while I'm here. There's Haji and Kirk and Ivana and Brewster and Jug and a number of other people. There's Melody and a few others. No Man's Land. I appreciate you guys all being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Can't thank you enough. But let's get right back to it here. And let's go to the Articles of Confederation, because I keep talking about how, well, they say it formally ended the war on September 3rd, but it really did not. And there was some concern that if they didn't work out this deal, the American side was like not really in awesome shape. The army was kind of disbanding, and they were concerned that the British were ready to restart things and try to take over. Well, we know that happened some years later, but so they were concerned about that already. So here from the Articles of Confederation. The United States, what is this, Article 9, I believe? Man, it's been a while since I read through the whole thing. It is Article 9. All right, cool. The United States, in Congress assembled, shall never engage in a war, nor grant letters of marque and reprisal in time of peace, nor enter into any treaties or alliances, plus a bunch of other stuff, unless 9 states assent to the same. So they have to get agreement of 9 states, not a majority of the House of Representatives and then Congress and then signed by an executive, but instead this is a union of states, and the states send representatives to the Confederation. Previously it was the Continental Congress, but the Confederation Congress. And those representatives of the states have to make the determination, and it needs to be 9. Now, there were some problems, especially in late 1783. This was signed in September, but delegates were called to convene at Annapolis. This is from the Maryland State House because, well, the old Maryland State House was then serving as the nation's capital. They called delegates from the states. Remember, they were delegates, not necessarily representatives, in November of 1783. The treaty stipulated that Congress approve and return the document to England within 6 months of being signed. And from my understanding, it's like 2 to 3 months to just ship it there. So they had to move pretty quickly on this. And, well, there was a problem. However, representatives from 9 of the 13 states were required to be present in order for Congress to proceed. And it was nearly 6 weeks until enough members assembled to hold a vote. And even though they had a majority present to hold a vote, that was still only 7 states. So even if they could start voting and doing business, but they certainly did not have the 9 states present in order to do stuff. And here from the story behind the Peace Proclamation, peaceproclamation.com. It'll be linked to in the show notes. However, they write, just 7 states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, had sent full delegations to Annapolis. Only 1 representative from New Hampshire and South Carolina was present, so they weren't able to vote. They did not have their delegation. Not one of the 20 congressmen in the assembly was from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, or Georgia. We had some people MIA. All the delegates could do, they write, was wait for their missing colleagues. Roll calls through December and into January brought no relief. The deadline grew closer with each day. Now, I went to government-run school, so my math is pretty terrible. Basic things like calendars, I got to think through. So September, October, November, December, January. They had till February 3rd, 1784. And already into the beginning of January, they can only get 7 states there. And part of the problem was, well, the winter of 1783 to 1784, Thomas Jefferson called it one of the worst he had ever even heard of or known of. And here, just a quick overview from Wiki. Not always the best source, but this is just generic info. It's a nice overview. In North America, the winter of 1784 was the longest and one of the coldest on record. It was the longest period of below zero temperatures in New England, with the largest accumulation of snow in New Jersey and the longest freezing over of Chesapeake Bay. Hard to get yourself transported somewhere in the late 18th century in that. I mean, it's hard for me to get out in the cold if it's below 70, to be honest with you. But that's a different story. Old Wisconsin guy really kind of got weak once he moved to Southern California. At the time, the capital of the United States was situated on the Chesapeake at Annapolis, Maryland. The weather delayed congressmen who were traveling there to vote, or delegates, congressmen, whatever, to vote for the Treaty of Paris, which formally ended the American Revolutionary War. See, they're saying the Treaty of Paris had already formally ended and they were coming to vote. They're actually getting this wrong. I think when people read this, they're like, well, it almost puts the delegates in Annapolis, the representatives of the states, as being like unimportant, just the way that it's written. So I wanted to point that out. A huge snowstorm even hit the South. The Mississippi River froze at New Orleans, and there were reports of ice flows in the Gulf of Mexico. Just a little side, just to point out how bad it was. Here's how Jefferson put it. It was severe beyond all memory. He was the guy who was basically he was the floor manager in Congress, trying to get this deal done, asking people to send letters to delegations, trying to get them there. And here from Peace Proclamation again. By the end of January, the 3-month snow accumulation for Morristown, New Jersey, 25 miles from New York City, was 83.5 inches. We had one like that when I was a kid. It was like in the 90s of inches. I think it was the winter of 93. Man, I'm aging myself. Ice closed down Philadelphia's harbor December 26th, and Baltimore's on January 2nd. Roads became almost impassable. The temperature plunged to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit in Hartford, Connecticut. So it was bad. Jefferson acknowledges they were still freaking out because the British gave them 6 months. They agreed to 6 months, and going back on a deal is not necessarily the best move at all. They were concerned about that. Here from Peace Proclamation, they point out that not one of the absent states responded to a December 23rd congressional appeal that, quote, the safety, honor, and good faith of the United States required their immediate representation in Congress. Neither the New Jersey nor Connecticut governor acknowledged a letter Thomas Mifflin, president of Congress, sent informing them that the United States, now I think he took over as president of Congress sometime in November, sent them informing them that the United States could not meet the Paris deadline without the votes of their states. So in other words, hey, this is pretty urgent. If we can't get this done, we may have more war. That was really the concern. And here's how Thomas Jefferson put it, because there were some efforts in Congress in late December to try to still ratify it with just 7 states. I mean, the mentality of, well, this is an emergency. Let's just do what we say we need to do, despite what the rules give us, has been around all along. It was right there with the old revolutionaries. So many people tell us that, well, you got to go back to the Articles of Confederation because that'll solve all the problems. But there was a pretty significant contingent right at the end of the War for Independence, a long bloody war, who were just saying, well, even though it says we got to have 9 states, let's ratify with 7. And Thomas Jefferson was vigorously opposed to it. He wrote about it later in some notes on his early career, which you can see. This is basically from his autobiography. But he explained what the situation was, at least to him and those who sided with him on this. He said, they knew our Constitution. So the British, they understood it. They can read. They knew our Constitution. That is the Articles of Confederation. And they would object to a ratification by 7. You're telling us you've signed the deal, but your own rule says you're not authorized to do it? This is invalid. This is null. And, well, if you're willing to do that, how can we trust you? Is basically the mentality that Jefferson was trying to express to his colleagues. And he said if that circumstance was kept back, so if we just kind of lied to him about as well, because that was another suggestion, let's just tell him it was cool, it would be known hereafter and would give them ground to deny the validity of a ratification into which they should have been surprised and cheated, and it would have been a dishonorable prostitution of our seal. So for Thomas Jefferson, of course, he said in 1791 that to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution for the United States was to basically give Congress a boundless field of power. Here he is saying taking this step, even for the sake of peace under a pretty crazy emergency situation, he said that's dishonorable. It prostitutes the seal. So here from Jefferson's compromise, he was, of course, elected to head a committee of members of both factions and arrived at a compromise. Now, some people say that Jefferson was actually, depending on where you read this stuff, they'll say that Jefferson actually was okay with a ratification by 7 states, and that is not what he had proposed as the compromise. But the assumption was that there were only going to be 7 states present. The other 2 were not going to fulfill their duty. They weren't going to make it. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe they just weren't on board. Who knows? But Congress would pass a resolution stating that the 7 states present were unanimously in favor of ratification of the treaty, but were in disagreement as to the competency of Congress to ratify with only 7 states. So in other words, Jefferson's like, look, we cannot just lie to these people about this. We cannot just violate the rules. And you guys are saying it's okay. We're saying it's not. So the best we can do in a deadlock situation is to come up with this. And we're going to say that everyone present is on board with ratifying the treaty. There is disagreement. So just be factual and honest about it because, again, you're still up against the mightiest empire on the face of the earth in world history, at least at that time. The result of that compromise from Thomas Jefferson was that the vote would not set a precedent for future decisions. The document would be then forwarded to the U.S. ministers in Europe, who would be told to wait until a treaty ratified by 9 states could arrive and to request a delay of 3 months. So in other words, hey, let's show them what we got, let them know the situation, and request an additional 3 months with the hope that, well, winter is over and everything's going to be better. Back to the Peace Proclamation. President Mifflin, meanwhile, made a last-minute attempt to secure a 9-vote treaty ratifying quorum. he sent Colonel Josiah Harmar, his aide, to New Jersey to plea for delegates. He also ordered Harmar to stop in Philadelphia to urge Richard Beresford, I don't know much about him other than this, a delegate from South Carolina, to leave his sick bed for the vote. So really, just the last minute, they're getting there. So it's on January 13th. They're already scheduling a vote on the Jefferson Compromise resolution, not officially ratifying, but a resolution explaining the situation. They're going to vote on that on January 14th, 1784. But on the 13th, the eve of the proposed vote, Connecticut delegates James Wadsworth and Roger Sherman and New Jersey's John Beatty arrived in Annapolis. Connecticut now had full voting rights, and Congress was only one state away from the treaty quorum. So 24 hours, less than 24 hours in advance, they're down to one state. It really gets down to the wire. The next morning, South Carolina's Richard Beresford saves the day. He arrived to complete his state's delegation, eliminating the need for the compromise legislation. The Congress unanimously ratified the treaty with 9 votes from Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. We also have New Jersey and New Hampshire, who were each represented by only one delegate. They were in support. And New York and Georgia had no delegates in Congress. I don't actually know why. Other people probably know quite a bit more. So on January 14th, 1784, it's actually, I don't know if it is anymore, but technically it was some kind of a holiday, a commemoration called Ratification Day. And that's what Dave Benner points out. He says, January 14th, 1784, the United States ratified the Treaty of Paris with Britain, bringing a formal end to the American War of Independence, or for independence. Now, Jefferson wrote the ratification legislation. He also used it as a basis for his peace proclamation, which includes Congress's promise to observe all the articles of the treaty. And it says, engaging and promising that we should sincerely and faithfully perform and observe the same, and never suffer them to be violated by anyone or transgressed in any manner as far as should be in our power. This is the proclamation of peace drafted by Thomas Jefferson and approved by Congress on January 14th. It also reminds the people that the treaty was approved on their behalf, quote, under the authority of that federal bond by which their existence as an independent people is bound up together, and is known and acknowledged the nations of the world. Again, Congress adopted this unanimously. And one of the other interesting points that I want to quick add as a side point here from history.com, they say perhaps as important as U.S. independence, and maybe as important, well, not as important as the peace, that of course was the goal, the Treaty of Paris also established generous boundaries for the new nation. New Union, we should really say. As part of the agreement, the British ceded a vast area known as the Northwest Territory to the United States. It included the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. And we know that less than 2 months after that ratification of the treaty, Thomas Jefferson got right to work again. March 1st, 1784, he submitted to Congress his report of a plan for government of the Northwest Territory, of the Western Territory, I think it was called in 1784. It established procedures for entering new states into the Union under the Articles of Confederation. And in it, Jefferson also proposed that slavery would be abolished in all those new states by the year 1800. So many people forget all the efforts that Thomas Jefferson made to eliminate slavery under the law. And they didn't approve it at that point, but they incorporated his language from 1784 into the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, probably the most impactful action of Congress under the Articles of Confederation. They also, years later, copied the language intentionally, and the radical Republicans said this in the later part of the 19th century. They copied Thomas Jefferson's from the venerable ordinance of Thomas Jefferson into the 13th Amendment to ban slavery almost a century later. I covered all that Northwest Ordinance, interesting history, in another episode, History Ignored, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. I hope you'll check that one out if you haven't as of yet. I think John Jay really summed up everything best when it came to signing the peace deal and the situation about the entire war and the conflict with the British. Here he is in a letter Just a few weeks after signing the Treaty of Paris, this is September 24th, 1783, to Governor Morris, he said, "While there are knaves and fools in the world, there will be wars in it. And that nations should make war against nations is less surprising than their living in uninterrupted peace and harmony." These guys really understood the nature of power. They understood the nature of government. They understood human nature. And I think because the government-run schools just don't teach this kind of stuff, maybe it's too geeky, too wonky, too much talking about free, sovereign, and independent states, I think it's our duty to get this kind of historical information out to as many people as possible. And nothing helps us get the job done on this more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. I've got it up here on the screen, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you like this type of historical information, you think it's important, we do much more on the Constitution, the Articles, how to defend the Constitution and liberty when the government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. And then, of course, during the early part of the year, we work on state legislation to undermine and defeat federal programs on all kinds of issues. That we cover in our annual report at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. But $2 a month really goes a long way. We punch way above our weight class here at the TAC. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Again, reminder, next week I'll be off, but I'll be here for another episode on Friday. So I look forward to seeing you here on the path to liberty.